The whole town of Harrow Creek had placed their bets, passed their judgments, and sealed their verdict on Ezekiel Ramsey, the way frontier folk sealed everything with certainty, and no room for appeal. But not a single one of them had accounted for the woman who arrived on the Tuesday stage with a deed folded in her coat pocket and dust on her boots, and absolutely no intention of asking anyone's permission for anything. It was the spring of 1874, and Harrow Creek, Texas, sat in a wide valley between two ridgelines that turned purple at dusk and bone-white at noon, a town of perhaps 300 souls who had grown comfortable with the stories they told themselves. The main street had a general store, a feed and grain, a barber shop, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Spur, and a small church with a crooked steeple that listed slightly eastward, as though leaning away from the saloon across the road. There was a telegraph office that received news 3 days late, and a post office that received everything else a week after that. It was the kind of town that survived on cattle drives and gossip in roughly equal measure, and the greatest piece of ongoing gossip, the one that had outlasted 3 mayors, 2 droughts, and a smallpox scare, was the story of Ezekiel Ramsey. Ezekiel owned the Ramsey Ranch, 4,000 acres of grassland and creek bottom that pushed up against the eastern ridge. His cattle were fine stock, his fences were well kept, and his horses were the best in 3 counties. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and hands that were permanently stained with the honest colors of hard work, calloused and sun-darkened and capable. He stood well over 6 feet, and moved with the quiet economy of a man who had learned long ago that most trouble could be avoided by not walking toward it. But his face, that was the thing the town could not stop talking about. The left side of Ezekiel Ramsey's face was unmarked strong jaw, straight nose, dark eye that caught light the way deep water did. The right side told a different story. A burn scar ran from just below his right temple down across his cheekbone, and along the edge of his jaw, pulling the skin there into a topography of ridges and pale discoloration that made strangers look away and children sometimes cry. He had gotten it at 24, in a barn fire that had killed his father and from which he had dragged his father's foreman, Cleet Diggins, out alive before the roof came down. Cleet had gone on to work for a ranch in New Mexico. The father was buried on the east pasture under a cottonwood, and Ezekiel had gone on living, running the ranch alone, wearing the scar the way the land wore its own marks without apology, without explanation. The town had decided, somewhere in the years between the fire and the present spring, that Ezekiel Ramsey would die alone. It was not said with particular cruelty, at least not always. It was said the way people say inevitable things, the way they discuss weather. He never came to town dances. He took his meals alone at the ranch or, occasionally, at the far end of the counter at Me's boarding house restaurant, where Me Tuttle was kind enough to seat him in the corner and not make a fuss. He conducted his business directly, and then went home. No woman in Harrow Creek had shown any interest in him that wasn't immediately quashed by a mother or an aunt who counseled the girl in question toward more conventional prospects. Once, 3 years prior, a widow named Clara Holt had brought Ezekiel a pie blackberry, still warm, and set it on his fence post with a note. He had eaten the pie and written her a polite note of thanks but had made no further move, and Clara had eventually married the new schoolteacher, which the town agreed was a much more sensible arrangement. After Clara, no one had tried. So when the Tuesday stage rolled into Harrow Creek on the 14th of April, 1874, and a woman climbed down from it with a battered trunk, a carpet bag, and the particular bearing of someone who had already made every decision she intended to make, the town noticed her the way it noticed anything unusual, immediately and with great appetite. She was Anna Garrison. 28 years old, though she carried herself with a steadiness that some people mistook for severity until they saw her smile. She had brown hair the color of strong coffee, worn practically in a twist at the back of her head, and gray eyes that were the shade of sky before a rainstorm, not threatening, just honest. She was not fashionably slender in the way that ladies' magazines recommended, but rather built for actual life, with strong hands and a capable frame that had clearly done real work. Her dress was plain but clean, a dark green wool that had been carefully mended at one cuff, and she wore good boots that had already seen significant miles. She had come from Missouri, from a small farming town called Darling, where she had spent the last 6 years caring for her ailing mother after her father died of fever. Her mother had passed in January, leaving Anna with a small inheritance, a strong desire to be useful in a new direction, and a letter from a land agent named Harlan Webb in Harrow Creek, Texas, informing her that the 40 acres adjacent to the Ramsey Ranch on the western boundary land that had belonged to a man named Rupert Garrison, her father's younger brother who had died without a direct heir, was legally hers. Anna had not known her Uncle Rupert well. He had gone west before she was born and had corresponded sporadically with her father over the years. But the land was real, the deed was legal, and Anna Garrison had stood in her emptied Missouri farmhouse in January with snow on the windowsill and decided that she was done waiting for life to come to her. She retrieved her trunk from the stage driver with a word of thanks, looked around the main street of Harrow Creek with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory, and walked directly into the general store to ask where she might find a room and a land map. The general store was run by a man named Horace Biggs, who was short and round and knew everything about everyone in a 40-mile radius. He told her about Me Tuttle's boarding house in the same breath that he asked her who she was and what her business was in Harrow Creek, and Anna answered him plainly, which Horace found both refreshing and slightly alarming in a woman. "Garrison," he repeated, rolling the name around. "You related to Rupert Garrison, had 40 acres out east." "He was my uncle," Anna said. Horace Biggs looked at her for a long moment and then said carefully, "You know that land sits right next to the Ramsey place." "I'm aware," Anna said. "I have the deed." "I'd like a land map if you have one." Horace had one. He sold her a copy of the county survey and watched her walk out with it tucked under her arm, and then he leaned over the counter toward his wife, Edna, who was pretending to arrange bolts of fabric behind him, and said, "Well, this is going to be something." The news traveled through Harrow Creek the way fire travels through dry grass in August, with speed and no mercy. By evening, everyone who patronized the Copper Spur knew that a woman had come to town, claiming 40 acres beside Ramsey's land. By the next morning, Me Tuttle knew it, the barbershop knew it, and the preacher, Reverend Calhoun, had already formed a pastoral concern about an unmarried woman attempting to work land alone. Anna, for her part, had eaten a solid supper at Me's boarding house, studied her land map by lamplight, and gone to sleep early. She had plans to make. The following morning she hired a wagon from the livery and drove herself out east on the county road toward her land. The morning was pale gold, the air still carrying the chill of night, and the land spread out on either side of the road in that particular Texas way, vast and indifferent and beautiful in a fashion that didn't ask for your appreciation. She crossed a shallow creek that she identified on her map as Cottonwood Run and followed the fence line until she found the corner post that marked the boundary of what the deed described as the Garrison 40. She climbed down from the wagon and walked the land. It was rough. Rupert had clearly not worked it seriously in some years. The small structure at the southern edge was more a lean-to than a proper dwelling, listing badly and missing part of its roof, and the soil in the flat middle section was good but overgrown. A windmill frame stood near what might have been a well, but the blades were gone. The fence lines were in poor repair, with several sections simply collapsed, but the creek ran along the northern boundary. The soil in the flat was deep black when she scraped at it with her boot heel. The grass was good, and there were mature cottonwoods along the creek that spoke of reliable water. Anna walked the whole 40 acres slowly, looking at everything with the eyes of someone who had grown up farming and knew the difference between hard and impossible. It was hard. It was not impossible. She was on her third circuit of the southern fence line when she became aware that she was being watched. She turned and found a man on a large bay horse sitting very still on the other side of the fence. He was at enough distance that she had to look carefully, and what she saw first was his size, very tall in the saddle, wide in the shoulders. And then, as she walked toward the fence, she saw his face. The unmarked left side, the strong jaw and dark eye, and then the right side, the scar that caught the morning light and ran its complicated geography from temple to jaw. She had been told about Ezekiel Ramsey. Tuttle had mentioned him the night before in the indirect way of someone passing along information they considered important, said he was a private man, said his land bordered hers, said he kept to himself. She walked to the fence line and looked up at him. "You must be Ezekiel Ramsey," she said. He had not expected that. Most people did not walk toward him. Most people found reasons to look in other directions. He had come out because he had seen the wagon from his east pasture and had ridden over to see who was on Rupert Garrison's land, half expecting a land agent or a surveyor or trouble of some variety. He had not expected a woman in a dark green dress to walk directly toward him. "I am," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who did not waste words. "I'm Anna Garrison," she said. "Rupert was my uncle. I've inherited this land." He studied her for a moment. "I know," he said. "Word travels in this county." "I expect it does." She looked across her fence at his land, well-kept grass, good fencing, a substantial herd of cattle visible in the middle distance. "Your ranch is impressive," she said, and she meant it in the plain way of someone making an accurate observation. Ezekiel looked at her steadily. He was trying to figure out what she was doing, the way she was looking at things, not at him, not away from him, just at everything with the same level attention. "What are you planning to do with the 40?" he asked. "Work it," she said. "I need to fix the well and the structure first. Get a proper fence line on the south side." She looked at the collapsed section. "Then I'll see about cattle, maybe start with a few head and build." He was quiet for a moment. "You've worked land before. My father's farm in Missouri. 6 years after he passed, before my mother went." She said this without self-pity, just as facts. "I know cattle less well than crops, but I'm a quick learner." He looked at her for another moment and something shifted in his expression, not much, just a slight easing around the eye. "The well has water," he said. "I had a look at it 3 winters back when the Garrison place sat empty. The casing is sound, but the windmill needs work." "I noticed the frame was there," she said. "That's useful to know. Thank you." He nodded once. There was a pause that could have been awkward but was not quite, because Anna was already looking back at her lean-to, calculating. "That structure won't hold through summer," he said, and he wasn't sure why he said it. He generally said as little as possible. "No," she agreed. "I'll need to build, or rebuild, rather." She looked back at him. "Is there a good carpenter in Harrow Creek?" "Tom Weaver. He's fair." A pause. "He's fair at price and fair at work." "Good to know," she said. She looked at him directly again, gray eyes level. "I expect we'll be neighbors, Mr. Ramsey. I'm glad to meet you." Something in his chest shifted, the way a door shifts when a latch it has held too long finally opens. He was not sure what to do with it. "Welcome to the county, Miss Garrison," he said, and the words came out less stiff than he had intended, which surprised him. He turned his horse and rode back toward his own land, and he did not look back, but he was aware of her standing at the fence line watching him go with that same steady gray gaze. He thought about it for the rest of the morning in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Anna went back to town and found Tom Weaver, a lean, sun-colored man in his 40s with a dependable handshake and an honest eye for materials. She showed him the survey map and described what she needed, and they agreed on a price for rebuilding the structure into a proper one-room cabin with a sleeping loft, reinforcing the well housing, and replacing the windmill blades. It was most of her inheritance, but it was the right use for it. She would need to find work in town to sustain herself through the building, and into the first season. Tuttle had already mentioned needing help with the boarding house kitchen, and Anna had said she would think about it. She thought about it for approximately the length of time it took her to walk from Tom Weaver's workshop to Me's boarding house, and then she accepted the kitchen work. Over the next 2 weeks, the rhythm of her days established itself. Mornings at the land, watching Tom and his helper, a quiet young man named Pip, work on the cabin. Afternoons in Me's kitchen, where she proved to be an efficient and creative cook who quickly earned Me's genuine respect. Evenings studying the county's agricultural patterns, the cattle prices, the state of the grass range, making notes in a small journal with a stub of pencil. She went into Harrow Creek proper nearly every day, and every day the town regarded her with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. That was the standard frontier response to a woman operating independently. Some people were kind, Me Tuttle, Tom Weaver, the land agent Harlan Webb who had been straightforward in all his dealings with her. Some were less kind, in the way of people whose world view is disturbed by the existence of someone who doesn't fit their categories. Sheriff Dale Prout was among the neutral to wary, a tall man in his 50s with a gray mustache and a methodical disposition who had stopped by the Garrison 40 on his rounds one morning and asked Anna a series of questions about her deed and her intentions that were politely framed, but were clearly his way of establishing that everything was in order. She answered all of them plainly and showed him the deed, and he went away apparently satisfied, though not entirely comfortable. Reverend Calhoun made a pastoral visit to Me's boarding house and spoke to Anna about the challenges of a woman alone on the frontier, which Anna received with patience and redirected into a conversation about whether the church's congregation ever needed help with communal meals, which it did, and she volunteered to assist with the summer potluck, which Reverend Calhoun found entirely appropriate and which left him not quite sure what had happened to his original concern. It was Edna Biggs at the general store who told Anna, in the comfortable, straightforward way of women who have decided they like each other, about the full history of Ezekiel Ramsey, the fire, his father, the scar, the years of solitude, the way the town had organized its expectations around his unmarried state and his privacy. "They say he'll die alone," Edna said, folding a piece of muslin with precise efficiency. "Folks have decided it, like it's a settled thing." "That seems presumptuous," Anna said. Edna looked at her with a slight smile. "I've always thought so. He's a decent man. Bought grain from us every winter without complaint, pays what he owes on the day he owes it, and I've never heard him say a cruel word about anyone. But people see that scar and they've already written his story for him." "People do that," Anna said, and she thought of her own story, how many people in Darling, Missouri had written her story without asking her. The spinster daughter, the caretaker, the woman who had missed her moment. She had not missed her moment. She had simply not arrived at it yet. She was at the Garrison 40 the following morning, when Ezekiel rode along the fence line again. She thought he might simply pass, but he stopped at the same post as before, and she walked over and they talked. It became a pattern, not arranged, not discussed. He would come along the fence line on his east pasture rounds, and if she was there, he would stop and they would talk. At first it was purely practical. He told her which sections of the county road flooded in spring rains. She asked him about the local cattle buyers and which ones were honest. He told her about the grass varieties on the creek bottom, and she told him about the soil test she had done by digging in different sections of her flat. He mentioned that the Harrow Creek Cattlemen's Association met on the first Thursday of each month at the Copper Spur, and that they were occasionally useful and occasionally just an excuse for men to drink together. And Anna laughed at that, a real laugh, bright and sudden, and Ezekiel was startled by how much he wanted to hear it again. The practical conversations began acquiring other layers, the way geological strata form slowly under pressure, with the weight of time and proximity. He found himself lingering at the fence, longer than his rounds required. She found herself noting when his bay horse appeared on the ridge and feeling something that she examined honestly and identified as gladness. She learned that he had read widely, which surprised her because she had not expected it in a frontier rancher, and then felt slightly ashamed of the assumption. He had his father's library, several hundred books in the main house, and he read in the evenings by lamplight the way other men played cards. She told him she had brought 17 books from Missouri in her trunk, which had been the subject of some complaint from the stage driver, and he asked what she'd brought, and the list of titles opened a conversation that lasted the better part of an hour, both of them leaning on the fence post from their respective sides. The cabin was finished in early May, and Anna moved out of Me's boarding house and onto her land. She kept the kitchen work at Me's for income, and was now the owner of a small but solid structure with a sleeping loft, a good stone fireplace, and a properly sealed well with new windmill blades that turned in the Texas wind with a sound like a slow and patient heartbeat. She bought 2 cows from a rancher named Pete Holly's on the western edge of the county, good stock, both pregnant, and 3 laying hens from Edna Biggs's cousin, and she put in a kitchen garden behind the cabin in the rich black soil of the flat. It was more modest than she had imagined, looking at the deed in Missouri, but it was hers and it was real, and she found a satisfaction in it each morning that had the quality of something deeply correct. In the evenings, alone in the cabin with the oil lamp burning and the wind working at the windmill and the cows settled in their small pen, she thought about Ezekiel Ramsey more than was strictly necessary or sensible. She thought about his voice, the low, careful way it moved, and the way he sometimes almost smiled, a slight softening at the left corner of his mouth, the unscarred side, when she said something that amused him. She thought about his hands on the fence post, the size of them, the particular quietness of a man who did not reach for things until he was certain of them. She was not a woman who confused herself about her own feelings. She had been in love once before, briefly, with a young man named Patrick who had been charming and insubstantial, and had ultimately married a banker's daughter in Springfield. She had recovered from that in about 3 months and had never confused surface appeal for substance again. What she felt looking at Ezekiel Ramsey was not surface. It was a recognition of something deep and real, and she was honest with herself about this, frightening in its potential. She was not going to act precipitously. She was going to continue being his neighbor and his conversational companion at the fence post, and she was going to allow whatever was happening to develop or not develop as its nature determined. But she was watching. It was the second week of May when the trouble started with Clement Doyle. Clement Doyle was a land speculator, which in Harrow Creek in 1874 was essentially a polite name for a man who identified weaknesses in other people's holdings and exploited them. He was 45 years old, thin and precise, with the kind of clothes that said money in a community where most people expressed money through the quality of their livestock rather than their shirts. He had come to the county the previous fall and had acquired, through means that ranged from legal to adjacent to legal, 3 small parcels in the Western Valley. He had wanted the Garrison 40. He had made Harlan Webb aware of this in the months when the land sat in legal limbo after Rupert's death, and he had been preparing a claim through a distant relations argument that his lawyer in Austin was developing when Anna's arrival with a legitimate deed had cut that argument off at the root. He had been informed by Harlan Webb, professionally and without pleasure, that the land was legitimately inherited and there was nothing to be done. Clement Doyle did not accept there was nothing to be done. He simply recalibrated. He first appeared at Anna's fence line on a Wednesday morning in the second week of May, riding a gray horse and wearing his city clothes, and he introduced himself with a kind of oily pleasantness that Anna recognized immediately as the prelude to an offer she would not want. He offered to buy the 40 acres at what he called a generous price, which was less than half what it was worth as improved land. Anna thanked him and declined. He came back 3 days later and raised the price slightly and talked for a long time about the difficulties a woman alone would face in running land in this county, which Anna listened to with great patience and then declined again. The third visit was less pleasant. He mentioned, with careful vagueness, that there could be challenges, water rights, fence disputes, the kind of small difficulties that accumulated into serious problems for a person operating alone without knowledge of local arrangements. Anna looked at him for a moment after he said this, and then said, very clearly, that she understood exactly what he was suggesting, that she had the deed properly filed in the county register, that she had not traveled from Missouri to be intimidated by a man in expensive clothes, and that she would be very happy to involve Sheriff Prout if he felt it necessary to continue this particular line of conversation. Clement Doyle left. He was not finished, but he left. Anna rode into town that afternoon and had a direct conversation with Sheriff Prout about what had been said. Prout listened carefully and wrote it down and told her she had handled it correctly and that he was aware of Doyle's history and would keep an eye on things. He also told her, with the slight awkwardness of a man acknowledging something he found personally complicated, that she might want to keep Ezekiel Ramsey apprised, given that they shared a boundary and that Doyle had made some preliminary approaches to Ramsey land in the fall before Anna arrived. "Did Mr. Ramsey deal with it?" Anna asked. Prout allowed himself a slight smile. Mr. Ramsey came into town and told Doyle, in the middle of the Copper Spur with a room full of people listening, that if he came onto Ramsey land again, he'd be removed in a manner that would require medical attention. The smile became something more genuine. Doyle hasn't gone near Ramsey land since. Anna thought about this on the ride home and felt, alongside a genuine concern about Doyle's intentions, a warmth of something she might have described as solidarity. She told Ezekiel about it at the fence line the next morning. She told him plainly, the same way she told him everything, what had been said and what she had done about it. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, a muscle in his jaw had tightened in a way she had not seen before. "He's had his eye on this land for months," Ezekiel said, "before you came. I know, Harlan Webb told me some of it. He won't stop at words," Ezekiel said. He said it quietly, without drama, as a fact. "Men like Doyle don't stop at words. They move to interference, broken fences, spooked cattle, fouled water." "I know," Anna said again. "I'm watching for it." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that she had learned to read somewhat. There was a consideration happening behind them, a weighing. "If anything happens," he said slowly, "that you can't manage alone, I'll tell you," she said. And then, because she wanted to be clear, "Thank you, I mean that genuinely." He nodded once. The tightness in his jaw had eased slightly. "You're a capable person, Miss Garrison," he said, and it came out sounding like something more than a general observation. "So are you, Mr. Ramsey," she said. Something passed between them in the silence after that. Something that did not have a name yet, but that both of them felt the shape of. Ezekiel looked away first, down the fence line, and then said he had to check on a heifer that had been acting off, and Anna said she had to get back to the cabin, and they both moved in their respective directions with the slightly self-conscious awareness of people who have felt something they are not ready to discuss. That evening, Ezekiel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the lights in the small cabin to the west, barely visible through the cottonwoods, and tried to think about something else. He was not successful. He had not, in the 8 years since the fire, allowed himself to consider the possibility of anything more than solitude. It had not been a conscious choice in the beginning. He had been raw and burning in the months after, inside as much as out, consumed with grief for his father and with the new and permanent landscape of his changed face. He had thrown himself into the ranch, which needed him absolutely, and had existed in a state of such total occupation that there had been no room for anything else. As the years passed and the ranch grew into something genuinely strong and well-managed, the occupation had thinned, and in the space it left there was a silence he had learned to live in. He had seen the way people looked at him, the quick aversion, the careful politeness that was worse than aversion, the pity that was worst of all. He had constructed his life to minimize contact with those responses. It was a livable arrangement. Anna Garrison had looked at him and seen him, not the scar him. It was so simple and so shocking that he was still, weeks later, sitting with the fact of it the way you sit with a puzzle box whose mechanism you haven't yet identified. She had walked toward him at the fence. She had asked him practical questions and listened to his answers. She had laughed at his wry observation about the Cattlemen's Association. She had told him about Doyle without asking him to fix it for her, just telling him, as you tell a neighbor something useful to know, as you tell a person you trust. He did not know what to do with any of it. He thought he should probably be careful. He was not, he found, able to stay careful. The first Cattlemen's Association meeting that Anna attended in June was the occasion that marked a shift in the public understanding of the situation, though neither Anna nor Ezekiel had engineered it. They arrived separately. They ended up, by the logic of available seating, in a room that was fuller than usual on account of the agenda, sitting at adjacent chairs along one of the long benches that lined the wall of the Copper Spurs back room. The meeting was about the proposed routing of a new cattle trail that would cross through the county, which affected several ranchers significantly and generated considerable heated discussion. Anna listened carefully. When the question of the Eastern Fork came up, a routing option that would bring the trail directly across what was essentially the county road access to both the Garrison 40 and the Ramsey Ranch, she raised her hand and spoke clearly and knowledgeably about the drainage implications for Cottonwood Run, which she had been studying since moving onto her land. The room paid attention, partly from surprise and partly because she was making a good argument. Ezekiel, beside her, watched the room and said nothing during her presentation, but when a rancher named Gus Fielding challenged her numbers, Ezekiel leaned slightly forward and said, in his quiet, direct way, that Miss Garrison's drainage estimates were accurate and that he had observed the same patterns in the creek for 11 years. And Gus Fielding, who was sensible enough to respect Ramsey's knowledge of the land, backed down. They walked out of the meeting together without precisely deciding to. The night was warm and clear, full of stars that seemed to push down toward the flat, dark land like they were trying to get closer. They stood on the board sidewalk outside the Copper Spur for a moment, and Anna said, "Thank you for the support on the drainage point." "You were right," he said. "Saying you were right was just accurate." She smiled at that. "Nevertheless." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, as though the words had come out slightly ahead of his intention to say them, "There's a good view of the whole valley from the ridge on my north pasture. I go up there some evenings, if you ever wanted to see the land from that height." She looked at him in the warm dark. He looked straight ahead at the street, which she found endearing in a way she didn't examine too closely right at that moment. "I'd like that," she said. 3 evenings later she rode up to the ridge on the north pasture of the Ramsey Ranch on the bay mare that Tom Weaver had sold her at a fair price, and Ezekiel met her at the pasture gate, and they rode up the ridge together. The view was exactly what he had said, the whole valley spread out below them. Harrow Creek a cluster of lights to the west, the ranch lands rolling away in every direction, the 2 creek lines catching the last light like silver wire. They sat on their horses side by side in silence for a long time, and the silence was comfortable in the way that only silences between people who have found a true ease with each other can be. "My father used to bring me up here," Ezekiel said eventually. His voice was quiet against the big dark. "He said you couldn't make good decisions about the land if you never looked at it from the long view." "He sounds like a thoughtful man," Anna said. "He was." A pause, and then, "I think about what he'd have made of things, the ranch as it is now, the decisions I've made." Another pause, shorter. "I think he'd have been satisfied." "I think he would have," Anna said. She was not just saying it. She had seen the ranch in its details by now, the quality of the fences, the condition of the cattle, the care in the pasture management. She knew what that kind of thing required and what it meant about the person who did it. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and they were close enough on the ridge that she could see his expression clearly in the last light, something open in it, unguarded, the way land looks when you catch it in a particular slant of evening. "Miss Garrison," he said, and stopped. "Anna," she said. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Anna," he said, and the word in his voice had a particular quality that she felt somewhere in her ribs. I find, he stopped again. He looked back at the valley. She waited, patient as the land. I find that I am not especially practiced at saying certain kinds of things. I know, she said. Take your time. He turned back to her. I find that I am considerably better with you present than without, he said carefully, and that I look forward to the fence line more than is probably sensible, and that he appeared to reach the edge of his vocabulary for this particular territory. I wanted you to know that. Anna was quiet for a moment, looking at him. The scarred side of his face caught the darkening light, and she thought, not for the first time, that the landscape of it was neither terrible nor pitiable, but simply his part of the whole geography of the man, like the ridgeline was part of the valley. Ezekiel, she said, I came to this county for the land, but I will tell you plainly that some part of every day has been about this fence line conversation for weeks, and that has nothing to do with the land. She held his gaze steadily. I think you're the most interesting person I've met in years, and I am not a woman who says things she doesn't mean. He looked at her for a long moment, and the thing that had been building between them, all those fence post conversations and shared silences, and the evening ridge view and the cattlemen's meeting, pressed itself to the surface, and he reached out and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she turned her hand and held his, and that was the beginning of it properly, with the whole valley laid out below them, and the stars coming on overhead like someone was lighting lamps one by one across the sky. They rode down from the ridge in the dark, and Ezekiel walked her horse to the gate, and she said good night, and rode across her fence line to her cabin, and she sat at her small table for a long time after with her journal open and the pencil in her hand, and wrote nothing because she couldn't think of any words that were adequate to the evening, which was itself a remarkable thing for a woman who always had words. The summer settled over Harrow Creek like something golden and heavy, full of long days and the smell of cut grass and the distant sound of cattle moving on the range. Anna and Ezekiel fell into a rhythm that moved at the pace of the land, unhurried but certain, the way a creek knows where it's going without rushing to get there. He came to her fence line in the mornings and they talked. 2 or 3 evenings a week he appeared at her door with some practical excuse, a question about where she'd found good lumber prices, a bottle of the medicinal liniment that me Tuttle swore by for sore hands, and they would end up talking on her small porch until the stars were well established. She rode his land with him twice a week, learning the cattle management from a rancher who actually knew it, asking questions without embarrassment, and he answered her with the genuine respect of someone who recognized a capable learner. He did not touch her again after that night on the ridge, not immediately, because he was a careful man, and because he was doing something he had not done in a very long time. He was allowing himself to want something and was proceeding accordingly without rushing to the end of it. She respected this. She was not a patient woman by nature, but she found patience for him specifically because she understood that it mattered, and because the wanting herself had a quality of richness that she was in no hurry to abbreviate. The town noticed. The town noticed the way small towns notice everything, comprehensively and with commentary. It was the topic of the copper spur on at least 3 separate occasions in June, the consensus opinion cycling rapidly from disbelief through skepticism to something more complex. Me Tuttle told Edna Biggs that she thought it was a fine thing. Horace Biggs said he'd believe it when he saw it. Sheriff Prout said nothing to anyone but had privately revised his assessment of the coming year in Harrow Creek. Clement Doyle noticed, too, and did not find it a fine thing. Doyle had not abandoned his intentions toward the Garrison 40. He had merely become strategic. In June, Anna found a section of her southern fence broken, and 12 feet of her cattle wire peeled back in a way that was not consistent with the fence simply failing. It had the precise look of something done by pliers. Her 2 cows were in the adjacent section and had not escaped, fortunately, but she stood at the broken fence with her hands on her hips and felt a cold, clear anger that she did not allow to become panic. She repaired the fence herself that afternoon and went the next morning to see Sheriff Prout. Prout went out and looked at the fence and agreed that it had been cut. He made a note and said he would make inquiries. He also said, with the directness of a man who had been a peace officer for 20 years, "Miss Garrison, I cannot prove it's Doyle, and until I can, I'm limited in what I can act on formally. What I can tell you is that you should not be alone out there with no one nearby if this escalates." She told Ezekiel that same morning at the fence line, and she was direct about the whole thing, the cut fence, Prout's response, the implication. Ezekiel looked at the repaired section in silence for a moment, and then looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, a controlled, very precise kind of anger, the kind that had direction. "I'll ride the boundary more," he said. "My east pasture rounds already bring me along this line. I can move through earlier in the morning." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "But I also want to make it clear that I am not going to sell to him or be driven out. This is my land and I intend to keep it." "I know that," he said. "I've known that since the first morning you walked this fence line." She looked at him. "You saw all that in one morning." The almost smile appeared. "Miss Garrison, Anna, you walked every acre of that 40 before 9 o'clock in the morning on your first day on it. A person who does that is not a person who can be driven off." She laughed, and he smiled fully for the first time she had seen both sides of his face, the unmarked and the marked, the whole complicated geography of it, and it changed his face completely and made her breath catch in a way she did not try to hide. In July, Doyle made a more serious move. He sent 2 men hands he'd hired from a ranch over the county line to pull the Garrison cattle out of her northern section under cover of a dispute about a water rights marker that he claimed established the Cottonwood Run boundary differently than the county survey showed. The 2 men were at her fence line at dawn when Anna came out of the cabin, and she stood on her porch and told them very clearly that they were on her land, and that if they did not leave in the next 5 minutes, she would fire her rifle into the air, and every rancher within a mile would know something was wrong. One of the men, younger, less certain of himself, looked at the other man, and then back at Anna standing on that porch with the rifle in her hands and the gray morning behind her and her expression absolutely unambiguous. They left. She fired 1 round into the air anyway because she had said she would. Ezekiel was at her gate in 10 minutes, the bay horse lathered slightly from being pushed. He had heard the shot from his east pasture and come immediately, and she had never in her life been quite so glad to see a person ride up. She told him what had happened. He listened with that directed quiet of his, and then said he was going to ride into town and speak with Prout, and also with Harlan Webb about the water rights claim, and she said she was coming with him, and they rode into Harrow Creek together in the early morning with the kind of shared purpose that has its own particular intimacy. Harlan Webb took the deed and the county survey and spent 20 minutes going through the actual water rights notations and told them that Doyle's claimed marker was simply invented. There was no documentation anywhere to support it. Sheriff Prout took all of this information, added it to his previous notes, and told them that while he still needed to build a formal case, what he had was now enough to pay Clement Doyle a direct and formal visit. He did this that afternoon. Anna and Ezekiel did not hear exactly what was said, but Clement Doyle was seen leaving Harrow Creek on the evening stage 3 days later with his trunk and his city clothes, and Harlan Webb told Anna privately that Doyle had apparently decided that the Austin lawyer's fees were not worth the return on what had become a significantly more complicated acquisition than anticipated. He did not come back. Anna stood at her southern fence line the evening after Harlan Webb told her this, in the long gold light of a July evening, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a person who has held the ground they meant to hold. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned, and Ezekiel was there. He dismounted. This was new. He usually talked to her from the saddle through the fence. He tied the bay to the fence post and came to stand beside her, and they looked at the southern pasture in silence. "He's gone," she said. "I heard." "I'm glad," she said. "Not just for myself. I know he had designs on this whole end of the county." "He did," Ezekiel said. Another silence, and then he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing words with full awareness, "I have been thinking about something for some time, and I intend to say it now." She turned to look at him. The July light was deep gold, and it touched his face, both sides, and he met her gaze directly. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, I know I'm—" He stopped very briefly, and she saw him make a decision to say the next thing without retreating from it. "I know the town's opinion of my prospects. I know I am not an easy man and that there are aspects of—" He gestured just slightly toward his face. "Stop," she said, not unkindly. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the right side, the scarred side with the flat, full warmth of her palm, and felt him go completely still, like a large and careful animal that has been touched by something unexpected and is trying to determine if it is safe. She held his gaze. "I am looking at you," she said, "all of you, and I am very willing." He looked at her for a long moment, with something in his face that she thought might be the expression of a man who has lived for years in a closed room and has just felt a window open. He covered her hand with his own, where it rested against his jaw, and held it there. "Then I'd like to start immediately," he said. She laughed, and it broke the stillness. And he smiled, that full smile, both sides, and she thought, standing at the boundary of her own 40 acres with the July light going gold around them, that she had made exactly the right decision in every possible direction. He courted her the way he did everything, with deliberate care and no waste of gesture, but full of genuine presence. He brought her books from his father's library, marking passages he thought she'd like. She fed him supper on her small porch twice a week, and they talked until late on the subjects that mattered to them. The land, the county's future, the cattle market, books, the state of Reconstruction in the South and what it meant for the frontier's economics, the injustice of the displacement of the Comanche and the other tribes from these same lands over the prior decade, which Anna felt strongly about, and which Ezekiel had complex and honest views on that took many evenings to fully explore. He had traded fairly with Comanche hunters when they had come through the South pasture 2 years prior, and had seen the way the government's broken promises worked out on actual human beings, and he said so directly. She brought him into town in August for the summer potluck at the church, and this was a statement, understood by everyone present. She walked into the churchyard on his arm and stood beside him in the food line, and introduced him to people with the calm ease of a woman who is completely certain of where she stands. And Ezekiel, beside her, was straighter than she had seen him in public, not stiff, but present, like a man who has decided to be in the room. Miss Tuttle said afterward that it was one of the nicest things she had seen in her years in Harrow Creek. Horace Biggs lost his bet, which he apparently had actually placed with Gus Fielding, and paid up without complaint, which was unusual enough to be its own topic of conversation. Reverend Calhoun, pouring lemonade, watched Ezekiel Ramsey laugh at something Anna Garrison said, and the Reverend set down the pitcher and thought that God's arrangements were frequently better than anyone's predictions. September came with cooler air and the first hints of color in the cottonwoods, and the cattle were fat on the summer grass, and the county road was good for riding. Anna had expanded her herd to 8 cattle, and her garden had produced well through the summer. She was in the black, modestly but actually, and had plans drawn up for a second pasture section in the spring. She was sitting on the porch one September evening with her journal and the last of the light when Ezekiel came through the gate and up the path, and he was carrying something. She couldn't make it out until he was closer. It was a small wooden box, and he held it with a carefulness that told her it mattered. He sat down beside her on the porch steps, which was where they usually sat, and set the box between them, and then appeared to organize himself for some seconds. "This was my mother's," he said. "She died when I was 7. My father kept this for years." He opened the box. Inside, on a piece of folded velvet, was a ring, a gold band with a single small garnet, simple and honest and very old. He told me once that the right person would simply be obvious, that there would come a moment when not asking would be the stranger choice. He picked up the ring and looked at it and then looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. The evening was turning rose and deep blue behind him. "I have not been the easiest man for 8 years," he said. "I have not made my life particularly open to this. But I find that you have made every argument for why it should be open, and you've done it just by being exactly who you are, which is—" He stopped, and something like wonder crossed his face. "Which is the most remarkable thing I have ever witnessed." "Ezekiel," she said softly. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking you plainly because I don't know how to ask otherwise, and I think you prefer plain to ornate anyway." She looked at him for a moment with every careful and honest feeling she had, and she said, "I think you know exactly how I'm going to answer that." "I think I do," he said, "but I'd like to hear it." "Yes," she said, without a single reservation and with great enthusiasm. He put the ring on her finger, and then she reached up and took his face in both hands, the unmarked side and the scarred side both, and kissed him for the first time full and certain and warm as the September evening, and he kissed her back with the thoroughness of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally reached the shore. They sat on her porch steps for a long time after that, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, watching the dark come over the valley, and neither of them felt any need to fill the silence with anything at all. The wedding was in November, on a Saturday that turned out to be one of those late autumn days that the Texas frontier produced occasionally, like a gift, clear and warm. The sky, a deep particular blue. The cottonwoods along the creek already bare but beautiful in their architecture of stripped branches against the light. Reverend Calhoun performed the ceremony at the church with the crooked steeple, and the whole town came, or near enough to it. Me Tuttle sat in the front row and cried, which she had told Anna she would not do, and then done immediately when Anna walked up the aisle in a dress that me herself had helped remake from her mother's wedding dress, ivory wool with good lace at the collar and cuffs, mended with care and newly fitted. Ezekiel was standing at the front of the church when she appeared at the door, and the expression on his face as she walked toward him, both sides of it, the whole geography of the man she had come to know so completely, made several women in the middle rows reach for their handkerchiefs. Tom Weaver was there, and Harlan Webb, and Gus Fielding from the Cattlemen's Association, and even Sheriff Pruitt in his good shirt. Edna and Horace Biggs sat 3 rows back, and Edna held Horace's hand and whispered that she had always known this would happen, and Horace did not bother to dispute this. They exchanged the words with their eyes on each other throughout, both of them steady and certain and present in the way of people who have made a considered decision and are fully at peace with it. When Reverend Calhoun reached the end and Ezekiel bent to kiss her, the church erupted in something that was not quite dignified but was entirely genuine. The whole town had said Ezekiel Ramsey would die alone. They were wrong with a completeness that was satisfying to witness. The wedding supper was at me Tuttle's boarding house, where me and Anna's combined kitchen skills produced a feast that was talked about in Harrow Creek for the better part of a year. There was dancing afterward in the street, with a fiddle player and a man with a concertina, and Ezekiel danced with Anna 3 times with the slightly formal and completely earnest concentration of a man who has not danced in years, but is fully committed to the project. And she laughed and stayed close, and he got better. They rode home to the Ramsey Ranch that night. Anna's cabin on the Garrison 40 would serve as a pasture management station and occasional guest accommodation, but the ranch house was where they would live together, the substantial stone and timber structure that Ezekiel's father had built 30 years prior, and that Ezekiel had maintained and quietly expanded over the years. Anna had been there many times by then and knew it well, knew the library and the kitchen with its wide hearth, and the front room where the good rug lay in front of the fireplace, but she had not yet seen it with the knowledge that it was her home. She stood in the doorway for a moment after Ezekiel pushed it open, looking at the warm lamplight inside. He had asked Tom Weaver to light the lamps before they arrived, a thoughtfulness that moved her considerably, and then she stepped inside. He stood behind her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she had first seen on the ridge in the long dusk, open and unguarded, the whole complicated, beautiful face of him. "I believe this is where you're supposed to carry me over the threshold," she said. He lifted an eyebrow, the left one, the unscarred side. "Is it? I've been informed it's traditional." He said, and then picked her up with the easy completeness of a very strong man performing a task he has decided to execute properly, and carried her over the threshold, and she laughed the whole way, and it filled the house, which was not used to being filled with sound like that, and it sounded like the most natural thing in the world. They spent the winter learning the shape of shared life. It was not without friction. Anna had strong opinions about the kitchen organization that conflicted with the system Ezekiel had maintained for years, and Ezekiel had a habit of reading at the supper table that Anna found initially maddening, and eventually charming in the way that certain maddening things become charming, once you understand the person behind them. She was more social than he was by nature, and sometimes needed evenings in town that he was happy to give her without being required to attend himself. He was more methodical in his planning than she was, and sometimes needed her to slow down her own rapid decision-making, which she did when he made the case carefully, which he always did. They talked about everything. That was the thing that neither of them had expected to find, and that both of them would have identified if asked, as the central miracle of the arrangement. The ability to talk about everything, without performance, without guard, without the managed distance that most people maintained even with those they loved. They talked about the land and the cattle and the books and the memories of their respective parents, and the directions they hoped the ranch would grow, and the things they feared in the long watches of the night, and the things that made them glad. Anna took over the management of the household accounts with Ezekiel's full support and discovered, going through 3 years of books, a pattern of overcharging by a grain supplier in the county that Ezekiel had missed because he had not been looking for it, a small deception, accumulating to a significant loss. She brought it to his attention, and then accompanied him to the confrontation with the supplier in a manner that resolved the matter in their favor and established Anna's reputation in the county's commercial community with a clarity and completeness that served the ranch for years afterward. Ezekiel expanded the herd in spring, buying 40 head from a drive passing through, and Anna organized the logistics of the expansion with an efficiency that his longtime ranch hand, a Tejano man named Domingo Reyes who had worked the Ramsey place for 6 years, acknowledged with the genuine respect of someone who knows competence when they encounter it. Domingo and Anna established a working relationship based on mutual directness and mutual respect, and Ezekiel, watching them work through the arrangements for the spring branding one morning, felt something that expanded in his chest until it was almost more than he could hold. By April of 1875, Anna knew she was carrying a child. She told Ezekiel on the porch in the morning, with her coffee cup in both hands and the sunrise coming up over the eastern ridge, in the same plain, direct way she told him everything. He set his own cup down very carefully and looked at her for a moment, and his face did the thing she loved most, became entirely unguarded, entirely present, showing her every layer of what he felt. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was so entirely characteristic of him, his first thought her health, that she loved him more fully in that moment than she had the moment before. "I'm very well," she said. "I feel entirely fine. I expect that will change, but right now I feel fine." He reached out and took her hand. He did not say anything for a long moment. She could see him sitting with it, the full weight and wonder of it. "My father would have," he began and stopped. "I know," she said. He tried again and stopped again, and she watched him find the words with the patience she had developed for those moments when the territory was too large for his usual economy. "I want to be the kind of father he was," he said finally. "That's what I want." "You will be," she said, with the simple certainty of a woman who has watched a man carefully for a year. "Ezekiel, you will absolutely be." He pulled her hand to his lips and held it there, and neither of them said anything else for a while, sitting in the morning light with the spring ranch working itself awake around them, cattle moving in the near pasture, Domingo's voice somewhere in the barn, the windmill on the Garrison 40 turning in the distance against the pale sky. The pregnancy moved through the spring and summer in the way of all such things, with its own pace and logic and occasional drama, all of which Anna navigated with the practical good humor of a woman who approaches her body's workings as she approaches everything else, as a thing to understand and work with. Me Tuttle, who had assisted at several births in Harrow Creek over the years, came by regularly with advice and company. The county had a doctor, a young man named Dr. Ellsworth, who had been in practice in Harrow Creek for 2 years, who Anna liked for his straightforwardness and lack of condescension. Ezekiel was, in the way of a private man experiencing something of enormous magnitude, outwardly calm and inwardly in a state of sustained wonder that expressed itself in the most practical of ways. He rebuilt the spare room next to the main bedroom without being asked, producing a small and perfect nursery that he lined with good shelves at the right height, and painted a warm cream color using a tin of paint he ordered specially from the supplier in Abilene. He also, in an act that Anna found deeply moving, brought 3 books from his father's library and placed them on the nursery shelf, including a copy of a collection of folk stories that his father had read to him as a child. She came into the nursery one evening and found him standing at the window looking out at the east pasture, and she stood beside him, their shoulders touching, and looked out with him. "Are you afraid?" she asked. She asked because she was sometimes afraid not of the birth exactly, but of the enormity of what it meant. "Yes," he said without pretending otherwise, "and very glad both at once." "That seems exactly right," she said. In October of 1875, with the cottonwoods in full gold along Cottonwood Run and the ranch in the productive ease of a good autumn, Anna gave birth to their son. Dr. Ellsworth presided, Me Tuttle assisted, and Ezekiel spent the hours of labor in the front room in a state that Domingo, bringing him coffee he didn't drink, thought was probably the only time he had ever seen Ezekiel Ramsey unable to be still. When Dr. Ellsworth opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, Ezekiel entered with the extreme care of a man crossing into territory he considers sacred, and Anna was sitting up in the bed, pale and exhausted and luminous with a particular light that certain women carry after labor, and in her arms was a red-faced, dark-haired, vigorously alive infant son. She looked up at Ezekiel when he came through the door. He stopped at the bedside and looked at his son, looked at him with the whole complicated geography of his face, the unmarked and the marked, and she saw on that face something she had not seen before and thought she might not have words for a kind of arrival, a man finding a place he had not known he was headed for. "He has your eyes," she said. Ezekiel looked up at her. His dark eye was very bright in the lamplight. "He has your chin," he said, and his voice was thick with something that he was not trying to manage. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she shifted the baby into his arms, and he held his son with the same careful deliberateness he gave to everything, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused solemn interest of a new person encountering the world, and Anna watched her husband hold their child and felt something complete itself inside her. Some long loop of story coming closed with the satisfaction of a thing properly finished. They named him James Thomas Ramsey, James for Ezekiel's father and Thomas for Tom Weaver, who had built the cabin on the Garrison 40 and who, when told of this honor, went red in the face and had to be given a glass of water. James Thomas Ramsey proved to be a large, healthy, and extremely opinionated infant who expressed his views on the world with impressive volume, and who calmed most reliably in his father's arms, which Ezekiel attributed to the warmth of the baby's character, and Anna attributed to Ezekiel's deep fundamental stillness, which any sensible person would find calming. The ranch continued to grow. By 1876, they had incorporated Anna's 40 acres formally into the Ramsey operation, with the Garrison 40 running specialized cattle breeding stock that Anna managed directly, applying the study she had done and the learning of 2 years to genuine effect. The combination of their skills, Ezekiel's long knowledge of the land and its patterns, Anna's organizational precision and commercial acuity, made the combined operation something significantly stronger than either had been separately, and the county's cattle buyers took note. Domingo Reyes, who had been working the ranch as a single hand for too long, was joined by 2 additional hands that spring, a young man named Calvin from East Texas, and an older man named Hurst who had worked ranches in New Mexico and brought specific knowledge of water management that proved valuable in the dry stretch of summer 1876. Anna organized the hiring, handled the wage negotiations, and established a bunk arrangement that Ezekiel thought was considerably more humane than the previous one, which he admitted freely, and she did not make more of than was necessary. Harrow Creek itself was changing. The county was growing, a railroad spur was being discussed for the North Valley, and the town's population had increased enough that a second general store had opened, and Me Tuttle had expanded the boarding house by 2 rooms. Reverend Calhoun had gotten the church steeple straightened, finally, at a slight cost to its character in Anna's private opinion, and a new school had been built on the eastern edge of town. James, at 18 months, was walking with great determination in every direction at once, and had already expressed a clear preference for outdoor activities, specifically following Domingo around the barn, and attempting to participate in all tasks regardless of his current physical capability. Ezekiel carried him on the saddle in front of him on slow morning rounds with a care and pleasure that made Anna stop whatever she was doing when she saw them going out together, and watch, and feel the particular warm weight of a life that had turned out to exceed the best version of itself she had imagined. There were hard things, as there were always hard things in the life of the frontier. A harsh winter in late 1876 killed 17 head and required emergency feed purchases that strained their accounts for 3 months. Calvin, the young hand, was injured in a roping accident and needed 6 weeks of recovery that required everyone else to work harder, which they did without complaint. The railroad spur that was discussed came to nothing for the county, which was a genuine setback for the cattle shipping economy and required a renegotiation of their selling relationships with buyers to the north. And the land itself was always demanding drought and flood and grass fire, and cattle illness and fence repairs, and the constant negotiation between what the land would give and what you needed from it. It was not a soft life. Anna had known it would not be a soft life when she had come to it, and she found that the hardness did not diminish her love for it, but in some way was part of the love, the way that a relationship between real people includes difficulty and is not diminished by it. She found this, too, with Ezekiel, that the occasional friction of 2 strong people sharing a life was not evidence of the wrong choice, but of the right one. You did not get friction with someone insubstantial. Friction was the evidence of actual contact. In the spring of 1877, she told him she was carrying a second child, in the same way she had told him the first time on the porch in the morning with the sunrise and the coffee, and he responded in the same way. His first question her health, his first thought her care. This time she was more tired in the early months, which she found frustrating and which Ezekiel absorbed by quietly redistributing household tasks without discussion or ceremony in the way he had absorbed the first pregnancy, with a practical attentiveness that she had come to understand was one of his primary languages of love, not declaration but action, not performance but presence. She was sitting one evening in the front room, reading by lamplight while James slept and Ezekiel read at the other end of the good rug, and she looked up from her book and found him already looking at her. He had been watching her with that open expression that he had stopped trying to conceal over 2 years of marriage. She held his gaze. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. A pause. "I was thinking that the light is good," she smiled. "The light." "The room in general," he amended. "The way the room is." She understood what he meant. She had come to understand a great deal of what he meant in the spaces between his words. She set down her book and moved down the rug to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side. And they sat that way with the fire and the lamplight and the sleeping child nearby, and the whole deep-breathing ranch around them in the dark. "The whole town said you would die alone," she said, not for any particular reason except that she was thinking it. She felt him move slightly, not pulling away but shifting to look down at her. She looked up at him. "So they did," he said. "They were wrong." "Categorically," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and light and entirely his. He pressed his lips to her hair. "They were very nearly right, which I find more alarming than their wrongness." She lifted her head to look at him fully. "How were they nearly right?" "Because I had decided they were right," he said, with the honesty he gave to the things that mattered. "I had arrived at their conclusion through a different route. I had decided that this," he gestured, meaning the room, the life, all of it, "was not available to me. I had made my peace with that, or what I thought was peace." "And now," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the full, complicated face of him, and she could see every layer of it, the long solitude and the fire and his father under the cottonwood and the years of careful self-contained management, and the morning she had walked toward him at the fence line and all the evenings since. "Now I understand that what I had made was not peace," he said. "It was just very quiet." She felt her throat tighten with something that was not sorrow but was in the same neighborhood. She reached up and put her palm against his jaw the way she had the first time at the southern fence in the July light and felt him lean into it. "It's not quiet anymore," she said. "No," he said. "It is very much not quiet anymore." He covered her hand with his. "I am profoundly grateful for that." She kissed him, and the fire crackled, and somewhere in the house James stirred in his sleep and then settled. And the windmill on the Garrison 40 was turning in the night wind, audible on still evenings if you knew to listen for it. Their daughter arrived in September of 1877, with the same vigorous announcement of opinion as her brother, but with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin. And they named her Clara Rose Clara for the widow who had once left a blackberry pie on the fence post, which Ezekiel mentioned to Anna with a wryness she appreciated, and Rose because Anna had loved her grandmother's rose garden in Missouri and had thought of it every spring since. James, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the intense and slightly suspicious interest of a person encountering a new development that has not been adequately explained, and then within a week had reorganized his understanding of the world to include her with the generous adaptability of young children who have not yet been taught that adaptation is difficult. Ezekiel held Clara Rose on the porch the evening after she arrived, in the September warmth, with James sitting very carefully beside him, and trying to understand the principle of holding something small, and Anna watched them from the doorway and leaned against the frame and breathed in the good fall air. The ranch in the evening light, the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold, the cattle in the near pasture, the Garrison 40 visible to the east with its windmill turning, the small, solid, improbable, absolutely certain life that she had brought in a carpet bag and a deed to 40 acres and had built, brick by brick and conversation by conversation, and season by season into this. Ezekiel looked up and saw her in the doorway. He reached out his free hand toward her, and she came and sat beside him on the porch steps, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and he held his daughter in his other arm and James pressed himself against his mother's side, and the four of them watched the light go out of the day together with the patience and the plenty of people who have found where they belong. The town of Harrow Creek had said Ezekiel Ramsey would die alone. They had passed the verdict with confidence and moved on to other business, as towns do. They had not known about the woman with the deed in her pocket and the gray eyes, and the absolute refusal to look away from anything that mattered. They had not known about the 40 acres that sat waiting and the fence line that would carry conversations into something larger. They had not known that the right person arriving changes everything about the story, not by altering the person who was already there, but by being exactly and entirely themselves in the space that was exactly and entirely meant for them. The whole town had been wrong. The whole town, in the way of communities whose wrongness has been instructive, and whose members are mostly decent people when their assumptions are challenged, adjusted their understanding. And Harrow Creek went on, the main street with its general store, and its feed and grain and its copper spur, and its church with the newly straight steeple, and the Ramsey Ranch went on, growing year by year under the management of two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but an amplification of everything they each were. And the cottonwoods along the creek grew another ring every year, and the windmill turned in the Texas wind, and the cattle were fat on the good grass. And the children grew. James Ramsey, at 5, could name every breed of cattle his father ran, and had strong opinions about horsemanship that his father encouraged with patience and good humor. Clara Rose, at 3, had inherited her mother's gray eyes and her father's fundamental stillness, and showed every sign of becoming either a rancher or a scholar. And Ezekiel had quietly decided she could be both if she chose, and had begun adding children's books to the nursery shelf. Anna sat on the porch one October morning in 1880, her journal in her lap and her coffee going cold beside her, and wrote in the small, precise hand she had used since Missouri. "It is 6 years from when I stepped off the Tuesday stage with a deed and a carpet bag, and I have been trying to find words for the interior of this life, which is too large for the usual ones. What I know is that I came to claim 40 acres and found something of much greater acreage. What I know is that the land is good and the work is real, and the man beside me is the best person I have encountered in my years on this earth, which has not been a short time and has not been lacking in persons. What I know is that the town was wrong and that I was right to come, and that there is no road I would not travel again to arrive at this porch, this morning, this life." She closed the journal and looked out at the ranch, the good fences and the healthy cattle and the far line of the eastern ridge going purple in the morning. And then she looked at Ezekiel, who had come out of the barn with a cup of coffee of his own, and was walking toward the porch with that particular stride of his, the unhurried, capable stride of a man who is where he means to be. He came up the steps and sat beside her and looked out at what they had made together, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and James came running out of the barn behind him in the way of a boy who cannot be still before noon, and Clara Rose's voice came from somewhere inside the house with a question that me Tuttle, who was visiting, could be heard answering in her patient and affectionate way, and the windmill turned. And the cottonwoods along Cottonwood Run held their gold leaves against the blue sky for one more October morning, and Ezekiel Ramsey was very far from alone. He was, in fact, surrounded. He was, in every way that counted, entirely found.